Hi, everyone, and welcome to the ACSM Greater Regional New York Chapter podcast. I'm your host, James Jankiewicz, and today, Dr. Roland Carlstedt. Dr. Carlstedt is a licensed clinical psychologist, board-certified sports psychologist, and chairman and chief sports psychologist of the American Board of Sports Psychology. He holds research appointments with Harvard Medical School and McLean Hospital. His doctoral dissertation was the recipient of the American Psychological Association's Division 47 2001 Award for Best Dissertation in Sports Psychology. Dr. Carlstedt is a former professional team tennis player in Europe and coach on the professional tennis tours from 1988 to 1998. He has been featured in over 500 times in media and has presented over 200 seminars, talks, and workshops worldwide. Dr. Carlstedt, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Carlstedt, so it's long been held that athletes, being bold and strong, are more, let's say, for lack of a better word, mentally immune from psychological issues than other people. Let's talk about that. Is that a myth? Has it been dispelled?
Yeah, that's been dispelled. When I think back to my doctoral study days, the literature always emphasized the fact that if you hone in on athletes as a group, they have less psychopathology than their age-matched cohort who don't participate in athletics or sports. So, and this invulnerability myth has been dispelled, especially in the last few years, with some prominent athletes coming out in public and basically stating, they're taking game breaks from the game, like Osaka, the tennis player, and Michael Phelps has come out strong, mentioning, all of the mental issues that he's dealt with over the years. And so that's been dispelled. And I think research is being structured in a manner that doesn't allow or takes into consideration that the previous notion that athletes are less likely to have mental illness it really doesn't hold up when scrutinized at a deeper level.
That's so fascinating because it is kind of baked into the mythos of the athlete, right? It's just like if you're already in that arena, you've already been strong enough to get there, certainly on a professional level, and that, and that you're just naturally tough. But it's glad to see that they are human beings, not Greek gods, and they are subject to the same issues we are.
There's been a huge cultural change, even down to the way coaches deal with athletes now. In the past, you wouldn't admit to any frailties out of fear that you might be cut or not selected in a draft, or being benched. And nowadays, it's you have to take depression, anxiety, competitive anxiety, and a lot of other disorders or issues into account and try to deal with them on a therapeutic level and lend support, as opposed to being vindictive because somebody actually admitted to having some sort of mental frailties.
Right. And you, interestingly enough, so you spend time in the tennis arena, and McEnroe comes to mind, certainly in my generation, as somebody who clearly exhibited some sort of mental instability in terms of his temperament.
Well, there's that's a different context. So in the competitive arena, obviously when you flip out and go crazy, you're exhibiting personality and behavioral traits and tendencies that may or may not help you on the playing field. And so in that context, you probably wouldn't, label that as being psychopathology per se. It's there is a distinction between, let's say, exhibiting strange behavior on the playing field. If the strange behavior or behavior that's not producing best results is exhibited on the playing field, it's more of a mental training issue, as opposed to, let's say, dealing with depression, anxiety, phobias off the playing field. And in that case, does off the playing field actual psychopathology and psychological issues prevent you from excelling or exhibiting peak performance on the playing field? And if you use McEnroe as an example, he actually propelled himself forward by having inciting incidences occur, or he could even manufacture those at will to actually excel. So, and I suppose you could say that's that's not being fair, and he'd been accused of that as well. But the major distinction is, what's happening to an athlete off the playing field in their life, or in their behavior, that is impacting them as a human being. And usually, if they're burdened with psychopathology of some sort, it can impact their ability to play, but not always. And that's why they shouldn't be punished if they do have depression off the playing field, or anxiety, or phobias, or even substance abuse issues, eating disorders, to name a few issues that athletes are not immune to. But then, if they come out and make coaches, teachers, faculty, their teammates aware of that, they shouldn't be stigmatized to the point where they can't go on the playing field and still play their best, because there's ways to approach that I'll be revealing in my talk on Saturday.
That's very clarifying. No, thank you for that.
Sure.
That definitely works. The mental state of athletes generally has seemed to be on the rise. We're certainly talking about it more, everything from the high school level to the collegiate level to the professional level. How come? How come we see an explosion in these type of hot topics that seem to be dismissed all the generations prior to us?
I think we tend to label these generations. I think it's Generation Z now. Correct me if I'm wrong, but when you have these generational changes, and you have very famous athletes come out and admit that they're not happy, they're having major problems, depression, anxiety. There's numerous issues I could list here, but when they come out and have the platforms that they have nowadays through social media, it gets a lot of attention, a lot of publicity, and the field, whether it's coaches, owners, faculty, universities, they have to step back and say, hey, there's something going on here. And it led to a cascade of just lots of athletes at all levels, admitting, hey, I've got these issues, and it shouldn't be blown out of proportion as well either, because it's still a small subset, but it's massively larger than it used to be, because it used to be virtually nil in terms of who actually came out and would admit to what, let's say, Naomi Osaka admitted to. And so there's all kinds of instances of people coming out and actually making known that they've experienced problems. There's some who've come out after the fact. At McLean, I think Brandon Marshall actually came out and allowed McLean to make known through their mental healthcare initiatives that he actually was in residence there in an attempt to deal with a particular psychological issue. So I just think it's a change that needed to occur. Athletes need to be heard on a level that goes beyond just them being part of some machinery that's there for an institution or a team to win. So they've been humanized on a level that they never have before. And coaches can no longer get away with ridiculous things like withholding water and having draconian punishment fitness type routines. And the old school coaches may say, well, that's the way it should be, toughens them up. But my research says that's not the way to toughen up athletes. It's through validated approaches to mental training. And I've also identified a personality model that was a big part of my dissertation that predicts who's more or less likely to be vulnerable to, let's say, not performing up to peak performance, and at the same time being more vulnerable to psychological issues such as depression and anxiety.
So when we talk about depression, anxiety, and other psychological issues for the athlete, kind of walk us through or elucidate how exactly does it negatively impact their performance? Because it's so easy, especially when you're in the limelight, to just hide, and keep a stiff upper lip and try to march through it. How does it actually manifest?
Well, with the majority of athletes who do exhibit, psychopathology or on a lesser scale, psychological issues, the goal ultimately is to get them to go onto the playing field with a clear mind. And there's certain dynamics that occur in all sports, especially in pre-action phases of competition. So an individual who, let's say a golfer, a tennis player, basketball player, field goal kicker in football, they're expected to perform up to their peak, let's say, technical, motor, and physical ability. And what happens when you're not dealing with off the field psychological or mental issues is that when it comes to having to focus on the task at hand, you might very well experience intrusive thoughts that are totally irrelevant to the peak performance that you have to exhibit. So there's a clear, let's say, brain dynamic that occurs when an athlete has to focus on carrying out a particular task, whether it's hitting a baseball, shooting a penalty kick, or a gymnast, sticking a routine, and that's subtle intrusions can occur at a very subliminal level, and they can actually be illuminated using a biomarker protocol that I've developed and that we basically use to assess athletes and their ability to, let's say, perform despite having these off the field issues. So it's a combination of off the field therapy in a psychotherapy context, and then that has to transition to being able to perform up to your peak potential despite having those issues. And if they're not addressed, so if you're sort of hiding the off the field issues and nobody really knows about them, that could perhaps explain some bizarre thing like somebody striking out who normally would get a hit, or just missing a big free throw. So there has to be a knowledge of that stuff. It can't be hidden, because if it's hidden, you're vulnerable to these intrusive negative thoughts. And this personality model that I've validated also predicts who's more or less likely, of somebody who does have, let's say, psychological issues, who's more or less likely able to deal with them on the playing field or not. And once that athlete is identified, that's when you can employ biomarker approaches to really gain better mind control during these crucial moments where you have to respond to action or initiate action.
I know that's a really broad topic. Can you give us a little insight about how your method then helps athletes from their psychological problems actually impacting their performance? Like, I know you broadly covered it, but maybe like a little insight as to how, a little why, like one strategy, like how does that actually work?
Well, let's say you have competitive anxiety, and this competitive anxiety is brought on by just fear of failure, fear of letting your teammates down, fear of letting your coaches down. That may be preceded by just, let's say, generalized anxiety in let's say, a social context. So when you go onto the playing field, any of these intrusions are going to upset your ability to play up to your peak potential. So you have a peak potential threshold that is evaluated on the basis of an individual's technical ability, their physical ability, and actual outcomes associated with being able to do that. So if you have these intrusive thoughts, you have to engage in a biomarker approach so that you can see what's going on in an athlete who is vulnerable during actual competition. So, all athletes I work with, they wear sensor monitoring equipment that we then analyze, and there's some underlying biomarkers. One big biomarker of mental control is a phenomenon called heart rate deceleration in the pre-action phase. And if you don't exhibit that that's usually attributable to something happening in the brain at that moment that then disrupts the ability to transition from strategic planning and focus to actual action. And when this mechanism is disrupted, you'll usually see failure. And the origins of that can come from having psychological issues off the playing field. But the way to tackle it then per se is our mental training methods that allow you to sort of mechanistically set off this actual verified cascade of brain events that occur in a pre-action phase. So an athlete can basically control that through a very targeted type of breathing that it would take quite a while to explain that right now. It's better if that could be illustrated. But
yeah, no, that's fine. I just, and that's a great answer. Like breathing is a key technique, right? And I know you're going to go more into detail with this at the event.
But let me just say one thing,
Sure.
Because breathing can be such a sort of a cliche that it's very targeted and timed, and it has to be meticulously documented, and then you have to train somebody to manipulate the timing of it. So not all breathing is breathing, and so I want to make that clear, because that's one of my pet peeves when people breathe, but it's a little more complex than that.
Sure, absolutely. But thank you for giving us that. Is all of this categorically psychotherapy? And if so, is that the beginning and the end, the cure-all for what you guys do, or does it go beyond that?
It's psychotherapy generally relates to, let's say, off the playing field, in office, or nowadays virtual interaction with a licensed psychologist or other licensed and certified therapist. And there's a plethora of approaches to psychotherapy that tend to be sort of intuition driven. The therapist will basically try to determine whether somebody's getting better, and that determination is usually made on the basis of self-report. And people who report for psychotherapy, they tend to be high in a trait called hypnotic susceptibility. So not everybody with psychological issues are even going to show up. The ones that are low in this trait, hypnotic susceptibility, they tend to shy away from ever admitting that anything is wrong, and they're not accustomed to being self-reflective, introspective. So the person that shows up usually and admits to having these frailties, they usually are high in this trait. And if they're high in that trait, they're also susceptible to what's called a dual placebo effect, where both the practitioner and the athlete, in this case, believe that they're getting better because the psychologist, their whole existence is predicated on being able to help people. But self-report can be misleading, especially because of this dual placebo dynamic. So the approach that we advocate for is to bring biomarkers into this, because there's a bunch of, especially heart rate variability measures, that provide insight into how psychotherapy in the moment is actually leading to better self-regulation, and that can be assessed over time. So we do a lot of physiological monitoring remotely using sensor technology, and that's sort of the advance in the field that gives objective data-driven insight into, let's say, psychotherapeutic outcomes. And mental training, by contrast, is more directed at making sure or attempting to enhance or support your ability to do what you can do. Like, if you're a gymnast and you can stick a routine, but you're going through a hard time in your life right now, and you're not doing like you should, and you have a big event coming up, you can learn psychological approaches to, and document those approaches using the sensor technology and protocols that we've developed. But the mental training is sort of distinct from the psychotherapy. And talk psychotherapy is great too, because everybody wants to get something off their chest, especially if they're dealing with people who are going to judge them because, hey, you're an athlete, you got to be mentally tough. This can't be happening. But that no longer is holding up. The U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee and the Safe Sport Initiative is designed to really provide a support infrastructure for athletes who do feel that they need to talk to somebody, have some psychotherapy, and so we're all behind that initiative as the American Board of Sports Psychology. And but one thing I'd also like to emphasize, and I don't want to exaggerate the occurrence. So it's not massively widespread, but even the amount of people that are coming out and admitting to having psychological frailties as athletes is, probably 100-fold more than it was 10 years ago. But the sample size is still not huge. It's not a huge thing because there's also all kinds of evidence showing that participating in sports is massively beneficial for your health, mental well-being, and it's a very important, positive part of life for the vast majority of athletes. But that subset of vulnerable athletes who are actually experiencing that, they no longer have to fear that they're going to be looked down upon or handled in a way that's not acceptable, and that's leading to a change in culture. So that subset is basically has a support system, and coaches even have to go through special training now to make sure that they're cognizant of that. And there's some big name coaches, like they escape me right now, who've actually had I think a few have been fired just for being too old school when it came to how they perceived mental issues in athletes.
That's fascinating. And yeah, it makes sense that you'd have to train up the coaches as well, because it all begins and ends with them, right? On some level. Yeah. So they have to be the one to identify it. As I mentioned in your opening, you are the recipient of the American Psychological Association's 2001 Division of Sport and Exercise Psychology 47 Dissertation Award. Take us into that a little bit about what you created, the personality model that your research has discovered and quantified.
Yeah, so the model I investigated is called the high-risk model of threat perception. And, excuse me, one of my mentors on my dissertation committee advanced that model in a clinical context. And what that did was it identified 3 psychological traits that are associated with being more or less vulnerable to psychological disorders. And also, in the clinical context, who's more or less vulnerable to psychological disorders and who's more or less likely to present to seek treatment and who is not. And so I extrapolated on the basic premises and decided to see if the model could also predict who's more or less likely to excel as pressure goes up, or as I call it, critical moments, compared to those who falter when pressure goes up or there's more critical moments. So I basically had a sample size of about 2,000 NCAA athletes from about 7 sports, Division 1 and 2 primarily, and they basically took the self-report battery, and we tested for that first measure I already mentioned, hypnotic susceptibility. The second measure that's really the zone buster is the trait called neuroticism that a lot of people may be familiar with. That's associated with proneness to be anxious even in a non-threatening state. So even at baseline, people who are high in neuroticism are frequently on edge when there's no reason to be on edge. And then the third measure is called repressive coping, which is associated with the ability to sort of filter out anything that's not self-serving or intrudes with your ability to do what you have to do. So it's sort of like a psychological armor that allows athletes who are high in that trait to not experience the anxiety somebody who's, let's say, high in neuroticism is when the going gets tougher. And it turned out that of this whole sample, that the athletes who performed the best had the constellation of either high or low hypnotic susceptibility, low neuroticism, and high repressive coping, and they were We also did a neuropsychological test called the line bisecting test, and that showed that athletes with that ideal profile were relatively more left hemisphere predominant. And that tied into this pre-action thing that I meant earlier, where you can strategize, or strategic planning sort of originates in the left frontal lobe area of the brain. And then there's this transition to this heart rate deceleration phenomenon that goes through the motor cortex. And so it held up. Significant differences were shown, and it was quite elaborate, huge sample size, and we continue to use that model it's called the athlete's profile model in the context of sports, and it's highly predictive in determining who's more or less likely to falter or excel as pressure goes up. And we've got, I say we because I have a lot of colleagues now that are contributing to our database through our board certification programs. And so it's held up over time, and it's predictive, because if you know that somebody has, let's say, the worst or the maladaptive athlete's profile, which is high hypnotic susceptibility, high neuroticism, and low repressive coping, if you know somebody has that profile, they're more vulnerable to the choking phenomenon as pressure goes up. And that's also associated with sort of mind-body responding that is associated with, let's say, off the field psychological issues. So it's highly correlated with, anxiety. So it's a very predictive battery, and that sort of sums it up.
So, Roland, are these traits something you can see in the young? Like, if you are at a Little League game, can you see these traits starting to foment in athletes at a very young age? Can you sort of predict that?
Well, the brain isn't, long ways from being fully consolidated, but as you develop through different stages of sports, your experiences and your response to different situations can become ingrained over time. So there can be a cumulative effect of, let's say an athlete has good technical and physical skills in baseball or football or something. If they experience constant, let's say, faltering as pressure comes up, and you don't address that, you can develop toward full consolidation of having a profile that's not facilitating or being stable as pressure goes up. But I mean, you wouldn't, and that's one thing you have to be careful about too, is you wouldn't want to stigmatize anybody by saying, well, you're this or that prematurely. And even in a top athlete, when it comes to self-report tests, there's always a false positive and false negatives. So you have to go beyond the initial, let's say, questionnaire self-report based assessments to see what the reality is during actual competition, in which you quantify pressure performance. And that's a big part of the model, because let's say somebody has the worst profile. Are you going to cut them off the team on the basis of that? Are you not going to draft them? No, but it gives you some predictive insight. But ultimately, there's always, when it comes to psychological testing, you can have an error rate of 10 to 20%, and most batteries have a much higher error rate. So the predictive validity coefficient of this model is the highest in the annals of research into the area of mental toughness. But negative experiences, and let's say being exposed to a hardcore coach who's just too tough on a little leaguer, or even parents putting too much pressure and trying to live vicariously through their kids, that can have major consequences in their developmental process, and that could be associated with, let's say, having high neuroticism later on in life, which is really a problem both on and off the playing field. And so any sort of a maltreatment or abusive approach to coaching or dealing with athletes when they're young should be avoided. So positive reinforcement is important. Good coaching is important. but you'd never, say, hey, I can check that kid out, and I can see he's a loser or he's going to be great. You're more apt to look at actual skills, and then you'd have to quantify it, empirically, and see if you are predicting that he or she's going to be, good or bad over time. There's ways of doing that, but just right off the bat, that'd probably be malpractice to actually do that, and then purport that you can actually do that. There's actually one person, I'm not going to mention his name, but he got a lot of publicity. He purported that he could just look at an athlete and immediately tell you what sort of brain EEG signature he has. And this guy was not even a neuroscientist. You probably want to cut this out. This is like just a weird anecdote of some guy that consulted with a lot of major league teams. It was just bizarre because it's one of those fake news phenomenons that pervade in our society these days. Anyway, I'm sort of like rambling on right now here. So.
Take us then to, okay, so an athlete has these issues and they become a client of yours. How do you proceed with them? What do you do with them?
Well, initially there's always an intake process. The intake process is designed to see what the baseline level of what's called heart rate variability, and which measures that are associated with negative or positive responses or behaviors are prevalent or predominate. So that's done doing 2-minute baseline scans using heart rate variability, soft and hardware. And then part of that process also involves a cognitive stress test where you see the change from the baseline to the stress condition. And it's a cognitive challenge. I'm not going to reveal that right now in case anybody hears this and they want to take the test. I don't want to contaminate it. But it basically, the more you respond in a negative manner as reflected in these heart rate variability measures, that would predict to a certain extent whether you're likely to choke or not choke as pressure goes up. And then there's also a visual processing or mental control battery of looking at or requiring that an individual think of a positive, negative, and relaxation scenario while their HRV is being monitored. And we look at changes from baseline, and the greater the change, that's associated with a higher level of hypnotic susceptibility and mental control. And then there's a few other batteries that involve processing of visual stimuli and how that impacts the heart rate variability equation. And then that's just the intake that's done now you can do it remotely, or we do that routinely on site when we have lots of interns and visiting fellows that we train who want to be future psychologists. And then the next stage, though, is you have to cross-validate what the baseline tests actually predict, and that's crucial to the validity of what your, let's say, questionnaire-based or even these biomarker-based assessments purportedly predict. So then you go onto the playing field and you structure simulated situations that are sports-specific, and we have a psychological statistics that have higher order numbering or statistical outcome measures that are associated with more or less pressure. And we we monitor people constantly to see the change from a baseline situation, or let's say pressure level 1 compared to pressure level 10. And so you have to accumulate a lot of data, do the analytics on the data, and then you would transition to the mental training phase. And the mental training phase is more oriented at being able to bypass the cognitive approaches, which mostly are imagery or visualization based. And the issue with that is that that's a subjective experience of the person engaging in them, and it usually involves a lot of thinking instead of doing, and that in itself can be counterproductive. So you're told to do something that you think is mental training, and in the end you're actually causing disruptions that wouldn't be there if you weren't doing that in the first place, even though it's supposedly designed to make you focus and enhance your motor output. So we try to bypass that using the heart rate deceleration paradigm that allows you through this very structured, extremely well-timed breathing phenomenon of pre-action phases to set off the same cascade of mind, body, or heart-brain events, heart-brain motor events that occur in people when they are performing at their peak. So let's say an athlete has the worst athlete's profile, and you'd expect them, and the statistics bear out that they are choking as pressure goes up. They would be trained to induce the same neuropsychophysiological response that an athlete who doesn't falter exhibits, and that can be done mechanistically and trained like you would just train repetitively trying to hit a baseball or pitch a strike or shoot a penalty kick. And by doing that, you don't have the, let's say, the language component and the language area of the brain interfering with this seamless non-verbal or non-auditory phenomenon. And because visualization is sort of the go-to mental training technique, like, yeah, I visualize this and that, and there's a lot of like simplistic platitudes and approaches that really haven't been adequately validated, if at all, and a lot of negative outcomes aren't necessarily reported. They usually only just report, positive outcomes to get into journals and things like that. So, but the basic premise is you bypass the cognitive component by being able to induce a dynamic that you've already seen to occur in athletes who don't choke as pressure goes up.
I see. Thank you for that. That's really, really, really fascinating work. To wrap up, there are fellowship programs available for athletic mental health, right? Through the American Board of Psychology, board certification, and internship. Can you tell us about some of those visiting fellowship programs?
Yeah, sure. We instituted the first, well, I'm not going to say it's first, but we instituted, it's the largest now and longest running summer internship and visiting fellowship program in evidence-based applied sports psychology. We also have a clinical component that addresses the mental health side of the equation as well. Our internships are open to undergraduates, graduate students, professionals. The visiting fellowships are available for individuals who have at least a bachelor's degree, and then board certification is available to licensed professionals so that they can get specialization and competencies in applied sports psychology, and they can have a clinical emphasis if they like. And we're in our 18th year now. We've had over 200 people from all over the world, most of the United States, colleges and professionals who are seeking to, like I said, gain especially competencies and the associated credential of being board certified. And board certification as a psychologist is only available if you're a licensed psychologist, because only a licensed psychologist can actually call themselves a sports psychologist, which many people don't know. So.
Oh, that's interesting. And if somebody wanted more information on that, like how could they reach out to you, and how could they find out more information about those fellowships?
Yeah, sure. We're on we're on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and we have our own website, American Board of Sports Psychology.org, and they're free to contact me directly. We get lots of queries every year, for our programs, and yeah, so just get in touch. Love to hear from anybody interested in the field. One of our missions is really to also dispel a lot of the myths, or help move the field forward by being more, let's say, scientifically oriented, data-driven oriented, tech-supported approaches, and our paradigm and approach to training and certification was actually lauded in the Archives of Clinical Neuropsychology. They did a unsolicited review of our training manual. And you never know what happens when somebody reviews your work. It can go south, and it's not what you expected it to be. But we were like stunned to see how well it was received by independent reviewers, and that's become a calling card, because sports psychology as a field tends to be also very claims driven, and we try to be antithetical to that and push back against the idea that everything works. It's our philosophy is show us the data, and if something's not working, then you have to stop and regroup and try other approaches, and always in the context of the scientific and methodological approaches that almost everybody learns when they're going through graduate school programs in psychology or related fields, and especially at the doctoral level. And that can go by the wayside. So we're a strong advocate for enhancing or improving standards overall within the whole field. So
that's great. Thank you so much for your time, Roland. We really appreciate it. And you will be joining us this Saturday. And just to make the announcement, we have our 2023 annual spring meeting. The topic is Organized Sports in Crisis, Mental Health Outcomes from Athletic Participation. That's this Saturday, April 22nd, 2023. You can attend live. There will be in-person on-demand access from May 5th through the 31st. And it's at NYU Langone Medical Center Science Building, 550 First Ave, New York, 10016. Roland, on a final note, do you have a website or a contact where people, if they want to contact you directly, where they could reach you?
Yeah, that's American Board of Sports Psychology.org. And remember, it's sports psychology, not sports psychology. That's another big pet peeve. For some reason, that we let everybody, the vast universe of people who say sports psychology, and that's not really the name of the of the field. So it's American Board of Sport Psychology.org.
Thank you for clarifying that. And again, thank you for your time, and look forward to seeing you on Saturday.
My pleasure, James. Thanks for your interest, and I look forward to the meeting as well. Thank you.
See you then. Thank you.